So I thought, since Thanksgiving is upon us very, very soon here, I talked a little bit about some of the thoughts that have been going through my mind as look around, kind of watch and observe what's happening in American society today, and kind of wondering how did we get here? How did we get here? And so we're going to cover a bunch of topics. I'm going to talk about some musicians and some lyrics and try to use that to demonstrate my explanation of how we got to where American society is at today. And I will be the observer, not the opinion person. You don't have to believe my opinions. Maybe we'll get some conversation going a little later when people join, and maybe we'll see some urban wildlife down here in this little trail area in Scottsdale. See if we can see any animals down here early in a rainy morning. Very rare occasion that it rains here this time of year in Arizona. So we got a really big show. Promises a lot. We might as well just get started right into it here. I have this word that's been bouncing around in my head, and the word is Brezhnevification. And it kind of comes from this old Soviet leader who was in power for many years back in the 70s and all the way into the 80s, and I believe he even started in the 60s, and that was a guy named Leonid Brezhnev. And he was kind of known, especially later in his very long reign, known as being kind of out of touch, having a lot of health problems, and quite an elderly leader among many kind of aged leaders of the Soviet Union back at that time. And so the Brezhnev era is kind of known for this stagnation and this kind of backward-looking old guard that were seen as being sort of out of touch with the society that they were governing or the society that they were the leaders of. And of course, it's come to mind, not just with me, probably with many people, that our current president, as well as many of the leaders of the United States today, kind of fall into the same mold of this kind of like Brezhnev mold. So that's where I kind of get this thought of the Brezhnevification of the United States, and we're kind of in our own little Brezhnev era here, it would seem. And Biden's actually well older than most of those guys, those Soviet people who were considered to be so sort of out of touch with their time. Biden's already older than them, and theoretically, he could even be president well into his 80s, depending on how things turn out. And I think Brezhnev died at like 75. Chernenko, who followed him, died well earlier than where Biden's at right now. And I think a lot of people kind of wonder about the functionality just of the current presidency, the ability just to kind of function the way that a president would need to do on a daily basis. A lot of people kind of wondering and questioning that. And I think we can definitely say, whatever you think about the whole age factor, certainly we can say that Biden represents an old guard that is no longer very relevant to current American society and the people who live here. He's definitely represents a time of the past, a time that has passed, it would seem, and yet here we are. We have this president who at one time would have been very much in sync and in tune in terms of his ideas in politics. At one time would have been very much in sync and in tune with a certain segment of the American population. But today he's really struggling with that message, that sort of dated message that he has sort of put out there, where he wants to still convince people to kind of go back to some of the thinking that would have been more common let's say in the early 80s, the 1970s, the 60s and such. And I'll kind of explain what I mean as we go throughout the live stream. Looks like we've got one person who has joined so far and a thumbs up. Glad you could make it so early in the morning. So I want to tell you about my experience as a little child with something that was much more common at that time, and that was the labor movement and this whole concept that America, even when I was a little kid, America still had some industry left. We still had some factories and people who, that was their identity, that was their lifestyle. They worked in American industry and in factories. And they were members of unions and such. And this is that's what Biden's kind of known for, is kind of conjuring up this whole past aspect of American society. So I went to a babysitter when I was a little kid. When I started school, I would go there after school, etc. And as part of this household that I was in for a good portion of my childhood, the guy who was the husband of my babysitter, his name was Butch, and Butch was a factory worker. He was a union member. And so I remember kind of being an observer, even as a little guy. I remember observing, like, he had this stuff that in my own life I didn't see, because my family wasn't from that industrial kind of background. So he had things like a union jacket with his name on it, right? So it said Butch, and it had all kinds of patches. And he had a lunchbox that he would, thermos that he would go to work with. And I remember him going on strike, at least on 2 occasions. And he wouldn't just sit around the house when he was on strike. When they were on strike, he would go every day and walk the picket lines. And you can imagine walking around in a circle with a sign for 8 hours a day. Not a whole lot of fun, yet he would go and he would do that. I remember he was injured on the job at least 2 times that I remember, all big bandages and stuff. So these are the kind of things that I kind of learned being in this household that was a little different than my own. And kind of got me thinking, even back then, that there are still these people who, in his case, he was very solidly a Democrat. So that's the kind of backward kind of looking that Biden is trying to do today, trying to reconjure up this whole concept of American workers being solidly Democrats. And as you may have noticed, that's really been a huge shift that's taken place over my lifetime, this shift of working class people who at one time were quite solidly Democrats till today, it would seem. Total shift to being quite solidly Republican voters and believers, you might say. How did all that happen? It's quite a strange thing. So there was a song, and the song was by Billy Joel, and you've probably heard of Allentown. And in that song, Billy Joel says, and I'm quoting him here, I'm not going to sing it because I'm sure it's a copyright thing, so this is a quote. And he said, let me think of what he said here. So, every child had a pretty good shot to get at least as far as his old man got. But something happened on the way to that place. They threw an American flag in our face. And so, by this way of thinking, what really happened here in this shift of working class people toward the right side of the political spectrum was, in Billy Joel, I believe, in these lyrics, what we find is he's kind of saying that there was this substitute when America deindustrialized, when we shipped all of our jobs overseas, that there was some sort of substituting of an identity of a working class union person who would vote Democrat with sort of like patriotism, waving the flag, and saying kind of like, well, here's your new identity, right? Enjoy. You don't have your job anymore, but you do have sort of this new identity that's sort of been going to replace it. And so there's this concept that perhaps there was some aspect of trying to use people a little bit, or trying to give them something to replace what they once had. And so that, I think, is where this whole concept of they threw an American flag in our face comes from. Kind of like the old switcheroo, you might say, is one interpretation of how all this unfolded. So the next person that I want to turn to here, after one Billy Joel, would be one John Mellencamp. This is an even more kind of interesting case study in what we're talking about today. So as you know, Mellencamp has a song called Pink Houses. But Pink Houses especially talks about this whole concept of working class people, the average people. Sort of at one point having kind of a decent little life that they could live, didn't have to work on the weekend, right? We're going under a bridge here, so I have to talk much more quietly, but it looks like our signal is still okay. So as part of this Pink Houses song, one of the lines that you'll find in there is he's talking about kind of an average American thinks he's got it so good. And that's kind of a feature that you'll find among certain aspect or a certain sector of the American population, where they don't have much by an outsider type of analysis. You might say, well, they don't have a new Tesla. They don't have a nice fancy condo. They don't have a speedboat. And so sometimes there's this thinking of like, well, wouldn't they want more? That's too bad that they don't have much. But this line of thinks he's got it so good, there's a lot of Americans out there, if you ask them, you know, would you like anything more than you have? And they'd say, no, I've got everything. I'm so happy with what I have. I've just got my little piece of land, got my little house and an old pickup truck, and own everything that they've got, right? They don't have loans out on all this stuff. And so it's a very low cost lifestyle. And these kind of people, they don't need much to be happy. So as long as you can repair your own truck, rather than paying $300 an hour to take it to a dealership, as long as you kind of own your own little place, you grow your own food, stuff like that. Maybe you sell some chicken eggs. You don't really need to make much money to have what a lot of people in that sector of American society would consider to be the dream life, right? An amazing thing, as long as the government will leave them alone, let them have their guns and religion, and etc., without kind of getting into all that stuff and interfering with what they got going on. They're not really out there looking to do any better than they already have, right? And so again, this is one reason why perhaps Biden's attempt to convince people that through legislation and through government, we can make your life better. There's a certain part of the American population that just does not buy that. It just does not appeal to them. They do not need anything from the government. They're not on welfare. They have no involvement whatsoever. They are not invested in the government and the government doing things to supposedly make their life better. So that's not all Americans, of course, but that's this part of the population that we're talking about that seem to kind of undergo this shift from being very solidly Democratic voters to being very solidly on the opposite side of the political spectrum today. And we saw this shift starting Even way back in the early 70s, you might have heard of something called the Hard Hat, what was it called? The Hard Hat Riots, where during the Nixon years, construction workers would oftentimes kind of root for Nixon if he was walking by a construction site or something, and that was the first inkling, the first twinkling of this shift that has taken a very long time to complete itself, but it seems like today that shift is fully complete, and that therefore Biden trying to sort of court this group of people back to the Democratic side by saying, well, we're going to get you higher wages and stuff like that. It's kind of, it seems to be a little bit of an outdated approach, kind of missing, people just aren't really in tune with what he's got going on, it would seem, as far as that part of it is concerned. So that's some Brezhnevification, it would seem, that's happening. I have to watch out here we've had some rain this morning, as I mentioned. We've got a little bit of standing water down here. So while I'm watching out for puddles, let me check got a few notes here that I want to make sure that we don't get out of order in my thoughts, my pre-Thanksgiving thoughts today. All right. So back to John Mellencamp, right? I use him here because he's an example, a very interesting example of one of those people who did not make that shift from the left to the right politically. Very interesting. Because while probably most of his fans have completely shifted, Mellencamp continues to be very much on the left of the political spectrum. It would seem that he believes that this sort of transition and this maybe handing people an American flag in exchange for their jobs that we just shipped overseas, that's sort of in some ways somehow that we're kind of co-opting people into some sort of political beliefs that perhaps are not actually in their own best interests, etc. So from his view, his standpoint, it would seem that he would probably ask the question, why are you now so committed politically to a party that is really based on big business? It's something that wealthy people traditionally were the ones, or well-to-do people were the ones that were most likely to be part of this right side of the political spectrum. What are people doing over there that's not really, in his view, in their own best interest? And I guess this gets back again to this concept of, well, what do those people actually want? Many of them just want to live their lives without a lot of interference, kind of have everything that they really ever want to have. So lots of interesting little thoughts and little aspects to this whole concept of working class people in the US and their political shift over time. Maybe you've heard of something called the political horseshoe. Have you heard of that before? It's kind of an interesting theory here that I want to introduce into this conversation. So the idea is that if you drew a horseshoe, right, there is the two ends of it. There's a big gap between those two ends, or there is a gap between those two ends, but actually the gap is not that far distant. The horseshoe kind of comes back toward itself at the ends. And so the concept is that even though at the center of the horseshoe, the front of the horseshoe, you find the largest percentage of people, the largest percentage of voters, etc., it's those two extreme ends of the horseshoe on the left and the right that are actually, in some ways, closer to each other than maybe the more centrist political beliefs are. And this is oftentimes used in German history to explain things like the National Socialist or Nazi Party, especially in its early days, was not just a on the right thing. That's where the socialist part of National Socialist comes from, is there was a significant leftist sector to that whole movement, especially in the earlier days. People like the Strasser brothers, and you might have heard of Gregor Strasser, or the SA, the stormtroopers, tended to be kind of this ilk. You might have heard of Ernst Röhm. Those umlauts will get you every time. The O with the umlaut, right? Two little dots. But these are people who were the socialist aspect of all of that, and they sort of got pushed, you might say, pushed or more out of things over time. So my whole point with this political horseshoe when it comes to America is we do have today these two sectors that have really developed within our parties that are really on the edges. So you hear a lot in the media about the Freedom Caucus, for example, and a lot of talk about that. What we don't hear as much talk about, at least in the media, is that on the left there's also quite a fringe group. You might have heard of the Squad. Morning.
Good morning.
So you've got the Squad, you've got the Freedom Caucus, and unfortunately, while they represent not the majority, I'm sure by far, of Americans, they have the ability in our system to really hold America hostage and to basically say, if you don't give us what we want for our little pet project, because we're not thinking about America as a whole, we're not thinking about the American population generally, we're thinking about us and our supporters and what we personally believe. And so if you don't give us all of our demands, we're just going to hold the whole country hostage. And that's, of course, a very bad sign, in case that didn't come to your mind already. So anyways, back to the horseshoe, what these two groups that I've mentioned, what they have in common is, well, it's really starting to rain here. Might have to turn back toward the truck just in case, but what these two groups have in common is their willingness to sort of just burn the place down. And whether you agree with that whole concept of let's just burn it down, or whether you agree probably with the majority of Americans where it's more like let's try to adjust what we have and try to make some changes over time to what we already exists, whichever you think is the way to go, right? I think we have to admit that basically the fringes on the edge of the horseshoe both have that one commonality here in the U.S. in their willingness to just throw the baby out with the bathwater in order to kind of force what they believe on probably a larger populace that may not be quite so convinced that everything that they have to say is so awesome. So I guess what I'd like to say about Thanksgiving is that maybe it can be one day we can practice trying to come together and not behave like this senator has been behaving. One day where we can leave all of these political beliefs that we've developed, all of this factionalism, leave it aside for one day, not get into it with your own family and friends over something that is probably not as important as maybe the news media has convinced us that it is. And if we can do that for one day this week, at least that's a start. That's something that perhaps we can do more generally in American society for the future. And I'd like to suggest to you, whether you are getting together with friends or family this holiday, or for those who may not be able to do that, suggest a movie from the 80s. And I think it still holds up even today. You've probably seen planes, trains, and automobiles. If you haven't, definitely try to get a look at that. And even if you have, it's always nice to watch that around Thanksgiving. Kind of think about all that stuff that maybe politics and our own beliefs, maybe we don't have to roll coal over everybody in America that doesn't agree with us. This whole concept of rolling coal, you may have heard of, right? Drive around big truck, and if you see somebody in an electric vehicle, or you see somebody riding a bike, you even see somebody driving a Tesla, you hit the gas in your diesel and this big puff of black smoke comes out, and the people on the bike have to deal with that fact, right? Maybe we can stop rolling coal on each other, at least for Thanksgiving, and then maybe be able to extend that a little bit farther even. So I'll have a link on all this stuff that I've talked about, various links that hopefully will also be interesting and thought-provoking. And I think we're going to sign off for this morning by saying, wish you a happy Thanksgiving. We'll see you for a couple other videos around the holiday season, I hope. And until that time, goodbye.